It wasn't a coincidence, but the result of cold-blooded calculation. Among us lived a man who knew this long before anyone else. His predictions weren't published on the front pages of newspapers, but they were whispered in the corridors of the Pentagon, discussed in CIA offices and at closed meetings of world leaders. His name was Zbigniew Brzezinski. He wasn't a prophet or a mystic. Brzezinski was a professor, a strategist, an architect of American foreign policy, a man whose intellect was respected even by his enemies. He foresaw many events long before they happened, and his words are still stored in archives as a warning the world chose to ignore. This video is not about conspiracy theories. It's about factually documented analytical works. Works that, long before the invasion of Ukraine, called everything by its name: Crimea, Donbass, nationalism, Russia's geopolitical trap. Today, we'll explain why this man questioned the very idea of global balance, why he was considered more dangerous than nuclear weapons, why his predictions began coming true with almost yearly precision, and how one mind could foresee the collapse of an empire as early as 1991. Zbigniew Brzezinski wasn't born into intelligence services. He wasn't part of a secret program. His weapons were books, lectures, and strategic reports. But even in the 1970s, people listened to him as if he could summon the future. He didn't just describe geopolitics. He modeled it. Where others made assumptions, he made diagnoses. Where analysts said possible, he said inevitable in 10-15 years. In his famous grand chessboard, Brzezinski formulated an axiom: without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be an empire. He warned that the Kremlin would try to regain control over Kiev at any cost, through pressure, blackmail, or intervention. He described a future in which Ukraine would become the center of the struggle for a new world order. And this wasn't a gut feeling, but a chronological map of events. The first major shock for the world was the fulfillment of Brzezinski's warning about the fall of the USSR. He claimed it wouldn't be external pressure but a moral crisis and lack of internal unity that would cause the collapse. Washington laughed at the time, but 2 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed exactly as he had said. His next prediction was a war in the Middle East. Brzezinski wrote that the U.S. would be drawn into a conflict that would destabilize the region for a decade and weaken the West's global influence. Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan. Everything unfolded according to the scenario he had outlined, but his real breakthrough was his 2006 forecast about Eastern Europe. At a closed session of the Analytical Council, he presented a report that directly stated the high probability of a conflict involving Russia and Ukraine between 2013 and 2025. The report mentioned Crimea, ethnic fault lines, distrust toward NATO, and an internal crisis in Russia. He asserted, if the world does not begin to act preventively, a chain reaction will occur that will lead to the collapse of the architecture of European security. These words were perceived as paranoia, but only 8 years passed. And everything began. Brzezinski never believed in coincidences. He said, history is not a stream of events, but a sequence of steps taken or not taken. In his view, Russia would go all in when trapped in an economic, political, and demographic dead end. And Ukraine would become the key, not just a territory but a moral frontier, over which a war would begin. Not a war of tanks, but a war of civilizations. In the final years of his life, he repeated more and more often, do not let Putin live to see a geopolitical revenge. If you miss the opportunity in 2014, the next chance will only come in 2025. But by then, the price will be much higher. He wasn't wrong. Today, his reports are quoted, though they were once ignored. His books are studied, though they were once called alarmist, because nearly everything he predicted came true. Only one thing remains, the final scenario in which Russia loses control, China distances itself, and Europe stands before a choice. either to become a battlefield or a new center of gravity for those who survive. He was considered a madman. There are no grounds for conflict, they said in the West at the time. Russia will integrate, Ukraine will stabilize. But Zbigniew Brzezinski did not back down. He showed that empires do not return with tanks, but with a sense of lost greatness, and in 2014, everything happened exactly as he had written 10 years before the events. At that point, he became not just a legend, but a threat. But the most important thing began later. Since 2019, according to sources, his strategic model began to show systemic failures inside Russia itself. He warned, "The year 2025 will mark a phase of accelerated loss of legitimacy. A military coup is possible if the Russian government makes 3 systemic mistakes in a row." He stated, "Ukraine is no longer just a theater of war. It is a catalyst for a global shift." It was after these words that Brzezinski's name began to be deliberately erased from international forums and academic conferences. He stopped being quoted in official reports. He faded into the shadows, yet continued to operate through closed analytical channels, working directly with private strategic centers. Why is he feared? Because he dismantled the illusion of freedom. If a system can be calculated, if a political catastrophe can be predicted as precisely as a solar eclipse, then who truly governs this world? Presidents or formulas? Zbigniew Brzezinski stripped the elites of their sense of control. He revealed that the future is almost already written, and that perhaps someone, somewhere, already knows the script. In the next segment, you will learn how his model pinpointed the possible date of Russia's capitulation, why he described Lukashenko as the breaking point of Eurasian politics, and how both the United States and China quietly began preparing for a scenario Brzezinski had outlined. Over 20 years ago, a scenario tied to the years 2025 and 2026, the years when regimes cease to defend themselves. Russia is now approaching the point of no return, the very threshold he described back in 2006. After the annexation of Crimea, his words became too dangerous to be spoken in public. He did not simply warn. He identified the turning point 3 years before the invasion, describing the unfolding scenario step by step, and everything began to happen exactly as he had written. From that moment on, he was treated as someone who knew too much. He was not fantasizing, he was calculating. His algorithm, based on the theory of geopolitical games and the logic of conflicts, revealed not only the outcome, but also the dynamics of collapse. As if someone had already written the script in advance. And with each new phase, the scenario kept coming true. At the beginning of the 2000s, Brzezinski launched a detailed data-gathering project on Russia's political architecture, without access to intelligence sources. He studied the behavior of key figures, ministers, generals, governors. His model, as later acknowledged in a Rand Corporation report, accounted for variables that even the CIA had overlooked. And here is what he began to see. Loyalty does not vanish in the streets. It vanishes in the offices. When ministers fall silent, when generals give orders without enthusiasm, when regional leaders pretend to listen but are already planning their retreat in their minds, this is not fatigue. It is the symptom of political decay. The system appears monolithic, but inside it is already cracking. Distrust pulses through the corridors. Doubt flickers in the eyes of those who, only yesterday, called Putin their supreme leader. That is the first alarming signal. From below, economic rot begins to rise. Not among the oligarchs, they can survive anything, but among those who carry the state on their shoulders, district officials, department heads, provincial administrators. When budgets stop reaching the local level, when salaries are cut, when taxes suffocate even the poorest regions, this is no longer an error, it is system failure. Next comes international isolation. It is not the sanctions that matter, but the loss of status. When a state is no longer feared, no longer respected, no longer invited to the table of negotiations, it has already been erased. It is spoken of behind closed doors not as a participant, but as a problem, and, the most dangerous of all, the friction between the military and the political leadership. This is not something visible on a television screen. It is what happens behind the scenes when generals begin asking too many questions, when informal centers of influence emerge beyond the Kremlin's control. That is not a conspiracy. It is something far worse. It is the scenario of refusal to obey. Brzezinski called this the point of refusal to defend. It is not a revolution. It is the moment when the elites stop playing by the Kremlin's script. It is not loud declarations. It is silence. When a system is left without defenders, it collapses on its own. He reminded his readers, in the late Soviet Union, no one stormed the streets with pitchforks. They simply stopped carrying out orders. They simply stopped believing. They simply stayed silent. And that was enough. Brzezinski's model revealed, from 2025 onward, Russia enters this phase. If pressure continues, if mobilization resources are depleted, and if propaganda loses its value, the state will find itself in a condition of elite apathy. And that, he warned, is even more dangerous than open revolt. He wrote, "The true collapse does not begin with an uprising. It begins with silence. When the army does not betray but simply refuses to fight. When it does not renounce allegiance but simply stops defending." Today, in mid-2025, we are witnessing precisely this. Regional elites are shifting responsibility. Telegram spaces are being cleansed of inconvenient questions. Generals vanish, resigning, dying, or falling silent. Society is exhausted, fearful, and restless. But none of this is news. These are mathematical variables within the equation Brzezinski solved long before 2022. If his model is correct, the next phase is not rebellion. It is silence. The elites retreat, the army hesitates, the people remain mute, while the authorities continue shouting into the void. But why did Ukraine occupy the central place in his calculations? Why does China refrain from open intervention, yet prepare, in silence? And which three states might disappear from the world map by 2030 if Brzezinski's logic proves correct? Ukraine lies at the heart of the new geopolitical map. Although Brzezinski did not make direct public statements about Ukraine's role after 2010, in analytical reports passed through closed channels to Rand Corporation research groups, Ukraine was identified as a zone of focal compression. This was his term for territories where the interests of three or more superpowers intersect simultaneously. Such zones cannot be managed locally. Any intervention provokes counteraction from all directions. Since late 2021, when his team ran simulations of Eastern European scenarios, Ukraine consistently appeared in 3 out of the 4 most likely global crisis points before 2030. In fact, it is a geopolitical knot from which the main conflicts of the future radiate. Why Ukraine in particular? Brzezinski identified 4 key factors that transform Ukraine from an object into a player. The resistance of 2022. He wrote that resistance under invasion is not merely defense. It is the activation of the national self-code. It is the moment when a society sheds the schizophrenia of a transitional era and begins to think as a unified whole. He stated, if a country passes through an existential phase and endures, it gains subjecthood, even if its cities lie in ruins. The complete reset of elites. According to his data, by 2024, up to 70% of Ukraine's governing class had either emigrated or been replaced. He called this the zero cycle of governance, in which the old political DNA burns out and a new architecture of power emerges. 1. Without the Soviet shadow. the exhaustion of Russia. Brzezinski emphasized that no regime can sustain an offensive war indefinitely without compensation of resources. No regime can sustain an offensive war indefinitely. After 2022, Russia did not gain resources. It gained isolation and sanctions. And that, in his words, means the aggressor weakens faster than the victim. The strategy of China. Brzezinski believed Beijing would act as a silent investor, observing, waiting, and at the moment of destabilization, moving into the vacant zones of influence. If Russia were to lose control of the South, China would intensify its presence in Central Asia and use Ukraine as an economic corridor to the European Union, bypassing Moscow. The most important point, however, was his forecast of a new world. Map. Brzezinski wrote that in 2026-2027, a redistribution of spheres of influence would begin, not through open wars, but through the quiet federalization of former empires. Russia, he predicted, would not disappear, but would fragment into managed zones with varying degrees of autonomy, similar to the late Soviet Union. Ukraine, however, would become not only the eastern border of a new Europe geographically, but also conceptually. He called this the Phoenix effect, destruction as the condition of rebirth. Ukraine, after the war, he wrote, would no longer be the same state it was before the war. It would be a new entity, with a new code. In 2023, in one of his closed interviews, never officially published but preserved in the archives of the Princeton Center for Geostrategy, Zbigniew Brzezinski uttered a phrase that still sends chills through analysts to this day. If Kiev endures, it will gain not only peace but the right to dictate rules to the new powers. Ukraine will either be consumed or it will become the model. There is no third option. And now, in mid-2025, we are witnessing this model take shape before our eyes. A new army, the reform of the security service of Ukraine, the digitalization of defense, the decentralization of decision-making. This is not merely a reaction to threat, it is the germination of a new state, hybrid, flexible, capable of fighting and governing simultaneously. What matters most, however, was something never spoken of publicly. In Brzezinski's analytical forecasts for 2026, there was a clause that, according to his colleagues, never left the confines of closed strategic briefings. If, by the summer of 2026, Kyiv retains legitimate power and Moscow fails to regain control of the southern regions, a rollback effect will begin. What does this mean? According to Brzezinski's forecast, the regions of the Russian Federation would begin to copy the Ukrainian model informally, first in economics, then in politics. This is not a Maidan nor NATO. It is an idea that cannot be banned because it lives in the collective mind. Brzezinski called it the mirror effect, when it is not the fall of the regime, but the success of a neighbor that becomes the greatest threat to autocracy. In the next section of his work, he wrote, "Russia does not fear the American missile. It fears Ukrainian success." That is why his analytical team recorded China's strategic investments not in the course of the war, but in its aftermath. In Brzezinski's view, China prefers to wait, to observe, and only then to purchase influence. He believed that if Russia were to lose control of the South, China would expand its influence in Central Asia and use Ukraine as a transit point to the EU, bypassing Moscow. But his forecasts did not end there. In the mid-2010s, Brzezinski began developing a new model of global power redistribution. Unlike his earlier works, which focused on conflicts and the strategies of individual nations, this model was dedicated to the disappearance of states, not through war, not through coups, but through systemic collapse, through the inability to preserve themselves as political forms. He called them the vanishing states and predicted that by 2030, 3 countries would cease to exist in their familiar form. And this was not theory. It was calculation. The first state was logical. The second, unexpected. The third, shocking. Russia. Yes, Russia itself was the first on the list, but Brzezinski did not foresee a burning Kremlin or violent revolutions. He wrote, "Russia will not disappear as a territory. It will disappear as a vertical." He used the term cross-sovereignty, a situation in which different regions begin to live under different laws, when budgets are no longer shared with the center, when governors are appointed without the Kremlin's approval, when the army loses its authority and loyalty is no longer guaranteed. The critical period, 2025-2027. According to his model, this was when not revolution, but decomposition would begin. Fatigue of the elites, silent resistance, regional agendas, refusal to obey. He wrote, "Russia will fall not from a blow, but from the exhaustion of raising its hand. And even today, we see it. In the national republics, people recall their own heroes. Provincial mayors ignore Moscow. Military bloggers attack their own commanders, Iran. Many would be surprised. 1,000-year-old tradition. Religion. Control. Seemingly unshakable. Yet this, according to Brzezinski, became the Achilles heel of Iran. He called it the crisis of recurring revolution. 53. The coup against Mossadegh. 79. The Islamic Revolution, 2009. The Green Movement, 22. The protests of women and youth. Every 30 to 40 years, an explosion of a new generation against the old power. Each time, repression. But the idea never dies. It goes underground, only to return stronger. When people on the streets are no longer afraid to die, he wrote, the regime is already dead, only it does not know it yet. This gap between a digital society and an archaic authority, Brzezinski considered irreparable, and therefore fatal. North Korea. The most unexpected forecast. The DPRK, one of the most closed regimes on the planet. But precisely this, Brzezinski argued, made it the most vulnerable. He wrote, "No system can survive if it does not adapt to its environment, and the environment no longer supports Kim." According to his data, even China, Pyongyang's main patron, had begun to distance itself. North Korea failed to integrate into the post-pandemic world. The economy remained isolated, the ideology exhausted, the elite demoralized. The population increasingly consumed foreign content and information in secret. The regime still rests on fear, but fear is not the currency of the future. Brzezinski's conclusion: the world of 2030 will look different, not because someone triumphed, but because others could not hold on. And the greatest threat to autocracies is not NATO's army, not sanctions, but a successful Ukraine.